It was the kind of morning that didn't feel real. The air in the federal courtroom was too still, too quiet, the kind of quiet that came not from absence but from expectation. The room located inside the Fifth Circuit Courthouse in New Orleans was grand but not intimidating. Tall ceilings, polished wood everywhere, federal seals gleaming under a soft white lights. On any other day, it was a room for procedure, for calm, structured argument. For men and women in robes to weigh facts, cite precedent, and disappear into the rhythm of legal formality. But not today. Today, it felt like the room had been rewired. Row after row of dark benches were filled to capacity. Legal scholars leaned forward with notepads in hand. Political aides whispered to one another with forced calm, glancing at their bosses every few seconds. Reporters, some of whom hadn't stepped inside a courtroom in years, were adjusting tripods and checking audio levels. No one was scrolling through their phones. No one dared speak too loud. Something was about to happen. The event itself was innocent enough on the surface, the annual Federal Judicial Conference. Normally, it was a gathering of legal minds, federal judges, a few legislators, policy analysts designed to discuss abstract themes like judicial independence and constitutional boundaries. It was a place for process, not performance. But everyone in that room knew this year was different. Because this year the spotlight would fall on two women, two forces of history wrapped in flesh and blood. On one side, Judge Edith H. Jones, the iron-spined jurist appointed by President Reagan nearly 4 decades earlier. A woman known for her sharp legal mind, unshakable demeanor, and deep reverence for the Constitution. On the other, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a civil rights attorney turned lawmaker from Texas, whose rapid political rise was fueled by a voice that refused to soften in the face of injustice. These were not just public servants. They were symbols of tradition versus change, of restraint versus rage, of order versus urgency. And now they were about to face each other. Not in private, not through back-channel letters or quiet legal memos, but in full public view in a courtroom packed with witnesses, cameras, and a nation hungry for either vindication or drama. Some had come to see a spectacle, some had come for justice, and some perhaps came for something deeper. A moment of clarity in a world where institutions often felt broken and people couldn't remember the last time two sides truly listened to one another. There was a feeling hanging in the air, something between electricity and dread. Everyone could sense it. This room would not leave the same way it entered. And then she walked in. Jasmine Crockett, Congresswoman, former public defender, civil rights attorney, a first-term lawmaker from Texas who had already become a lightning rod in American politics. She didn't come in quietly, but she didn't need to raise her voice either. The sound of her heels clicking on the marble floor did all the talking. Wearing a deep charcoal suit and a steel expression, Crockett moved with the precision of someone who knew exactly what she stood for and exactly who would try to tear her down for it. She wasn't here to play nice. She wasn't here to shake hands and trade platitudes. She was here to speak truth, and she knew some people in the room would hate her for it. But she'd been hated before. She grew up in the South, learned the law not from books alone, but from watching what happened when the law failed people who looked like her. She didn't choose civil rights work for popularity. She chose it because people were still being sentenced more harshly for the color of their skin than for the weight of their crime. In the courtroom, she had fought for men no one else would defend. On Capitol Hill, she fought for communities no one else seemed to mention. And now here she was, a black woman standing tall in a federal courtroom in front of a wall of tradition, about to say what no one had dared say in a room like this before. The moment she took her seat, the camera zoomed in. The murmurs stopped, and for the first time that morning, even Judge Edith Jones tilted her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the firebrand from Texas had arrived. And across the room, she was already seated. Judge Edith H. Jones, a name that carried the weight of 4 decades of rulings. A woman who had outlasted presidencies, protest movements, and shifting tides in the law. Unshaken, unapologetic, unmoving. She didn't need to announce her presence. Her silence did it for her. Her black robes draped like armor across the bench. Her silver hair pulled back tightly, not a strand out of place. Her eyes, sharp as razors, scanned the room with the quiet authority of someone who had long since earned the right not to flinch. She had been appointed by President Ronald Reagan in 1985. Since then, she'd presided over more than 3,000 cases. And not once had she let public pressure dictate her interpretation of the law. To her, the Constitution wasn't a suggestion. It was a blueprint. You didn't bend it, you didn't modernize it, you upheld it, or you risked collapse. That belief had earned her praise from legal conservatives and grudging respect from even her fiercest critics. But it had also earned her a nickname, the Ice Queen of Justice. Not because she lacked heart, but because her heart was loyal to the law and the law only. In a world full of firebrands and headlines, she was cold steel. In a time of emotional outbursts and political posturing, she was the last vestige of discipline. And as she sat there across from Jasmine Crockett, whose energy burned like a wildfire, the contrast couldn't have been more striking. One was a storm of movement, the other the eye of the storm. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it. Something was about to happen. Not just words, not just tension, a collision. Between youth and age, between passion and precedent, between change and the system built to resist it. Judge Edith Jones didn't move. She didn't need to. The storm was coming straight for her, and she had every intention of meeting it head-on. The moment had come. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood and walked to the podium with calm defiance. No notes, no hesitation, just purpose. The room shifted. Not physically, but emotionally. It was like the oxygen changed. Her voice was steady, at first controlled, professional, powerful. She spoke about sentencing disparities, about prison conditions, about how federal judges often ruled without understanding what life looked like for people on the margins. The words were sharp, but it was when she paused, looked up, and let the silence settle that the air truly turned electric. And then she said it. Too many judges are stuck in the past. Too many wear the robe like it's a shield when it's supposed to be a duty. Respect must be earned, not demanded by robes. It was the kind of sentence that didn't just echo through the microphone. It slammed into the walls, it hit spines, it cut through decades of tradition in one clean slice. Several people in the audience visibly flinched. A senior judicial clerk's pen stopped mid-sentence. Even reporters, seasoned cynical, looked up from their laptops. Across the room, Judge Edith Jones remained stone still, but her eyes narrowed. Crockett wasn't finished. How can we expect people to trust a system when that system hands out justice differently based on zip codes, skin tones, and access to private counsel? We call it equal under law, but it's not equal in practice. And no title, no robe, no courtroom seal can cover up that truth. Every word was like a match, and the room was already soaked in gasoline. This wasn't a speech. It was a controlled burn, one that challenged the very architecture of judicial reverence. Crockett wasn't angry. She was precise, measured, and deadly honest. You could feel it. The ground beneath this courtroom was starting to tilt. It happened in a heartbeat, and yet it felt like the entire courtroom stopped moving. For a single second, you could hear nothing. Not a pen, not a whisper, not even breath. Judge Edith Jones's fingers tightened around the carved wooden arms of her chair. Not a tremble, but the grip said everything. She didn't blink, she didn't twitch. She just stared. Straight at Congresswoman Crockett, her eyes ice-cold, clinical, locked in, and then she stood. It was slow, deliberate. Each movement of her rising body felt like centuries of tradition pulling themselves up off the bench. Judges don't interrupt. Judges don't engage. Judges, especially at a judicial conference, do not take the microphone. But Judge Jones did. The courtroom, stunned by Crockett's speech, now froze again, this time for something even rarer. A sitting federal judge breaking protocol, not to lecture from the bench, but to speak publicly with intent. The sound of her heels hitting the floor echoed like a gavel. She walked, not fast, not slow, just inevitable. Every pair of eyes followed her like she was gravity itself. And for the first time since the conference began, Crockett's confidence flickered. Just slightly. Jones reached the podium, the same one Crockett had just stepped away from. She didn't smile. She didn't perform. She simply looked out into the crowd and then turned her head slowly back to Crockett. Congresswoman, she began, her voice calm but cold. I appreciate your passion, but I feel compelled to respond. The entire room held its breath again. Because this wasn't just a rebuttal. This was a reckoning. She didn't shout. She didn't raise her voice. But her words cut like steel. Congresswoman Judge Jones began. You stand here today in a federal courtroom, a room that exists only because of the principles embedded in our Constitution. She paused, not for effect, but for control. Every syllable after that felt sharpened. When you imply that judges must earn your respect based on whether their rulings match your expectations, you are not questioning a person. You are questioning the foundation of judicial independence itself. Her tone didn't waver. It didn't accuse. It stated. Cold, clear, undeniable. Respect for the judiciary is not conditional, she continued. It is a necessary element of the separation of powers. If judges begin to fear political retribution for following the law, then what you create is not accountability. What you create is tyranny. The room tensed, cameras clicked, but no one moved. When you measure judges by the outcomes you like, instead of the legal reasoning they apply, you reduce this sacred institution to a popularity contest. She didn't blink, didn't flinch, and let me be clear, what you propose may sound like reform, but it is a threat to the very idea that law should stand above politics. It was not emotional, it was surgical. Judge Edith Jones had drawn her blade not to wound but to warn, and the silence in that room said it all. This was not just a defense. This was a counterattack from the very heart of the Constitution itself. And then nothing. No comeback, no fire, no fury. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't fold her arms. She didn't shoot back with another viral quote. She stood there, still, silent. The room waited hungry for the drama they thought they were promised. People leaned forward, cameras zoomed in, staffers held their breath, ready to spin whatever came next into talking points. But it didn't come. Instead, Crockett just looked at Judge Jones. Not with defiance, not even with resentment, but with something deeper reflection. For the first time that morning, she wasn't just a congresswoman holding a mic. She was a student in the presence of someone who had seen more, judged more, endured more. And in that stillness, something shifted. This wasn't a pause. This was a pivot. The firebrand from Texas, the voice that had lit up headlines and challenged institutions, chose not to escalate. She chose to listen. And in a world addicted to reaction, that silence was the loudest sound in the room. When Jasmine Crockett finally spoke, her voice didn't rise. It fell, not in volume but in pressure. Gone was the fire from earlier. Gone was the edge in her tone. What remained was steel wrapped in velvet. She took a slow breath, not to compose herself, but to show that she already had. And then she looked Judge Jones straight in the eyes and said, "Judge Jones, where exactly do you believe I overstepped?" That was it. No defense, no spin, no talking over. Just a question. Simple, direct, devastating. Because in politics, asking a question like that isn't weakness. It's courage. It's standing in the middle of a storm and opening the door instead of building another wall. Crockett wasn't conceding defeat. She was inviting clarity. Her tone was soft but unmistakably strong. And in that moment, the room realized something. This wasn't just about a clash between institutions. It was a moment of deep character. Jasmine Crockett had chosen understanding over applause, dialogue over dominance, growth over pride. And somehow that single question echoed louder than any attack could have. You could hear it. A few people gasped quietly but audibly. Others didn't move at all. Staffers, reporters, even senior judges stared at Jasmine Crockett as if they weren't sure what just happened. Because this wasn't how these things usually went. In modern politics, humility isn't expected. It's rare, suspicious, almost seen as weakness. And yet here she was standing in silence after a direct challenge and asking with no trace of sarcasm, "Where exactly do you believe I overstepped?" No one saw that coming. Not the cameras, not the crowd, not even Judge Jones, who for the first time allowed her eyes to soften. Something had shifted. The mood in the courtroom, once thick with combat, was now heavy with reflection. It was like someone had cracked open a window, and for the first time all morning, fresh air entered the room. No shouting, no spin, no scripted soundbite. Just an honest moment between two women on opposite sides of power, but suddenly aligned in purpose. The moment was small, but it rippled. And in that quiet, many realized this was no longer just a confrontation. This was the beginning of something transformational. Judge Edith Jones did not sit down. She stood firm, not with arrogance, but with the quiet posture of someone who had waited years to say what came next. She looked at Crockett, then at the room, and finally at the cameras that had once felt like predators, but now felt like witnesses. Her voice was measured, calm, but it carried weight like marble falling in a silent hall. "If the law is unjust," she said, "then change the law. But don't ask judges to break it for you." There it was, not defiance, but definition. Jones wasn't standing against reform. She was drawing a line between the role of a judge and the power of the legislature. The judiciary, she continued, isn't your enemy. But we cannot do the work of lawmakers. We are bound by what is written, not what is hoped for. The room, once eager for fireworks, now leaned in to listen. And for the first time, her words didn't sound like cold doctrine. They sounded like a bridge one built with experience, not resistance. A bridge that didn't deny injustice, but demanded structure so that change could last. Don't tear down the walls of the court, she said softly. Bring the bricks to build something better. And just like that, the most feared judge in the room became something else entirely. A teacher. Of all the moments in that hearing, this one no one expected. Not the firebrand monologue, not the cold judicial stare, not even the clash of institutions. But this, Jasmine Crockett picked up a pen and began to write. Not a soundbite, not a tweet, not a rebuttal. She took notes, like a student, not a politician. It was surreal, because in this room, surrounded by cameras, egos, and legacy, taking notes was the most radical thing anyone could do. Reporters stopped typing. C-SPAN zoomed in. Even Judge Jones blinked just once. No script, no theatrics, just ink on paper, and a woman in power choosing to listen instead of dominate. For decades, people had fought to be heard in that room. But now someone was choosing to hear, and that was more revolutionary than any microphone. The room had grown quiet, not the awkward kind, the reverent kind, like people knew they were witnessing something rare, something fragile, something real. Judge Edith Jones cleared her throat, not to regain power, but to offer something she rarely did abridge. She looked at Jasmine Crockett, who still held her pen ink, still drying on the page. I've seen passion like yours before, Jones said. It burns bright, but it burns out if not guided. Crockett looked up, and then Jones did something that stunned even her own clerks. I will guide you, she said, if you are truly here to do it the right way. There was no sarcasm, no sting, just the kind of directness that only comes from people who've been through the fire and lived to teach others. It was a proposal, not of politics, but of partnership. A moment where judicial tradition and legislative fury didn't cancel each other out, but instead merged into something powerful. You could feel the weight of it, not a truce, not a surrender, but a willingness to believe that reform didn't mean tearing things down, but building them together. In that courtroom, a line had been crossed, but for once it wasn't a violation. It was a beginning. The cameras were rolling, microphones lit up. Social media was foaming at the edges, waiting for a new fight, a new fire. But what they got was silence, and then a voice. Jasmine Crockett stood, slowly, deliberately. She wasn't the firebrand now. She wasn't the warrior. She was something far more dangerous, an honest woman in power. Judge Jones. She began, her voice steady, into the judiciary at large. She paused, looked at the reporters, then at the law clerks, then at the American flag behind the bench. I came here ready to fight. I came here thinking I knew everything, but I forgot the most important part of public service: humility. The room was breathless. I let my passion cloud my understanding of the Constitution. That's on me, and I'm sorry. Gasps, whispers, the kind of awe that only happens when truth cuts deeper than spectacle. This isn't surrender, she said, and it isn't weakness. It's what real patriotism looks like. And for the first time in that chamber, no one clapped. No one cheered. They just stood still. Because something sacred had just happened. Not political theater, not gotcha moments, but the rarest thing of all: growth. Federal courtrooms don't clap, they don't cheer, they don't do emotion. They run on precedent, procedure, cold formality. But today, something broke protocol. After Jasmine Crockett's words, the silence was heavy, almost sacred. Then someone moved, a court clerk. He stood up, hands at his side, then slowly he clapped. Once, twice, then again. No one stopped him. A second followed, then a third. Within seconds, the room was on its feet. Lawyers, clerks, even the court bailiffs in uniform, applauding. Not for show, not for politics, but for what they had witnessed: a reckoning, a transformation. A woman unafraid to tell the truth, not just about the system, but about herself. Judge Jones didn't speak. She didn't need to. She simply gave a small nod, and in federal court, that nod was everything. It wasn't a verdict. It wasn't a headline. It was something rarer: respect. It took 32 minutes. That's how long it took for the clip of Jasmine Crockett's apology to hit every major news outlet in America. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, even late-night hosts, they all played it. And for once, they didn't argue, because what had happened in that courtroom wasn't red or blue, it wasn't left or right, it was human. Headlines lit up the screen. Congresswoman admits she was wrong, and the nation listened. Rare grace in Washington, standing ovation in courtroom. Jasmine Crockett's moment of truth stuns both parties. The video went viral not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. People who had never heard her name were now quoting her. Veterans, teachers, retired judges, single moms, all saying the same thing. That is leadership. That gives me hope. The clip played in diners, in airports, on subways. Even on the floor of Congress, a senator whispered, "Did you see her?" In a nation exhausted by performance politics, this moment felt like a breath of truth. In a quiet classroom at Georgetown Law, an old professor pressed play. The screen flickered. There she was again. Jasmine Crockett, standing in a federal courtroom, owning her mistake with grace and courage. The room of students sat still, not scribbling, not checking their phones, just watching. This, the professor said, pausing the video is what the separation of powers looks like, not in theory, but in action. He pointed at the screen. A legislator challenges a judge, the judge responds, and then the legislator listens, not with ego, but with humility. Silence. We don't teach this enough, he added, but we should, and this wasn't just at Georgetown, Harvard, Howard, Berkeley, even community colleges in Ohio and Texas. Professors rewrote syllabi to include the Crockett moment, not because she was right, not because she was powerful, but because she changed. And in that change, she showed young future lawyers something no textbook could. Power isn't the enemy of humility. It's where humility matters most. It started with a whisper, not from activists, not from the media, but from the halls of Congress itself. A Republican senator from Utah was caught on a hot mic saying, "Maybe we've been too quick to demonize the courts." On the House floor, a progressive Democrat from California paused mid-speech, looked across the aisle, and instead of launching another attack, she said, "Maybe we need more listening, like Crockett did." The moment had not just gone viral, it had become contagious. Committees that once opened hearings with fire and fury now started with a moment of pause. Crockett was no longer just a name. She was now a reference. This is a Crockett-style question, a young lawmaker joked during a judiciary hearing, meaning sharp but respectful. Reporters started using a new phrase, the Crockett effect. And most surprisingly of all, it wasn't partisan. Because what she had done wasn't about surrendering, wasn't about winning, it was about growing up. In a system addicted to outrage, her moment of humility had somehow made adulthood cool again. The banner behind them read National Summit on Legal Reform. The room was packed, judges, students, lawmakers, journalists. Everyone expected the usual talking points, division, and careful language. But then they walked out together. Judge Edith Jones, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, once fierce opponents, now standing side by side. The applause was hesitant at first, then it grew. Crockett took the mic. "I came into that courtroom months ago ready to fight. But Judge Jones didn't fight me back. She showed me what judicial integrity looks like." She turned to Jones, and I listened. Then Jones stepped forward. "Congresswoman Crockett reminded me that our job isn't just to interpret the law, it's to inspire faith in it." There was silence. The good kind. Then Jones continued, "We disagree on a lot, but we agree on this. The system isn't perfect. But it can be better if we build it together." The applause this time was thunderous. Leadership had always looked a certain way in Washington, loud, combative, untouchable. But then came Jasmine Crockett, not because she had all the answers, not because she never made mistakes, but because she owned them, publicly. There's a clip, just 27 seconds now, played in leadership seminars across the country. It's Crockett standing at a press podium, no teleprompter, no staff whispering in her ear. She looks straight into the camera and says, "I was wrong. I let passion get ahead of process. I forgot that justice isn't just about fighting, it's about building something better." That moment, raw, unrehearsed, wasn't weakness. It was leadership redefined. And in a world full of people obsessed with being right, she reminded us how powerful it is to be real. The courtroom looked the same, mahogany benches, brass lamps, solemn silence. But something was different. Crockett stood again behind the mic. No accusations this time, no fiery monologue, just presence. She wasn't the firebrand anymore. She was the bridge. Then from behind the elevated bench, Judge Edith Jones leaned forward. Her voice slow but unwavering. Congresswoman Crockett, she began, you honored this courtroom not by winning but by growing in front of it. You could hear hearts stop. Even the court reporters looked up from their typing. Jones continued, this bench has seen arguments, tempers, and battles, but what it rarely sees is humility. And that, Ms. Crockett, is what makes democracy possible. There were no cheers, no thunderous applause, only silence, the kind that lingers when something holy has just happened. And in that stillness, Crockett nodded, no words necessary, because when a judge praises you for your growth, that is the verdict that lasts longer than any ruling. The gavel echoed one final time, the courtroom emptied, but the story didn't end there. Because this was never just about Crockett or Judge Jones. It was about all of us, about every time we've let anger speak louder than understanding, about every moment we had the chance to grow but chose ego instead. So now we ask you, have you ever seen someone turn shame into strength? If you were in that courtroom, what would you have done? Would you have yelled louder or paused longer? Would you protect your pride or open your heart? Let us know in the comments. Share your truth. And if this story moved, you don't forget to subscribe, and pass it forward. Because today we don't need more heroes. We need more humans who dare to change. Real strength isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about knowing when to listen, when to reflect, and when to say, I was wrong. In a world that rewards certainty and punishes vulnerability, Jasmine Crockett reminded us that growth begins when ego ends. If a firebrand politician can put down her sword and pick up a pen to learn what's stopping us, every room we enter is a courtroom of character. Every day is a chance to turn anger into wisdom, and every apology is a bridge to something better. If this story moved you, if you believe that humility can change the world, then help us spread that change. Subscribe to our channel, like this video, and tell us in the comments, when was the last time you turned a mistake into growth? Together, let's build a community that values truth, grace, and courage.